Okay, good morning, everyone. The first topic that we're going to tackle this morning is what is HTTP, right? Whenever we go and we're changing in between sites and we're understanding how to kind of anchor tags work and how to create our links from one site to another. I'm sure you guys remember in one of the previous lessons, I tried to create some sort of anchor tag to Amazon.com, but I forgot to put the HTTPS at the beginning. And because of that, I was running into errors and it wasn't working correctly. So now, what is HTTP? Does anyone want to take a guess at what HTTP stands for?
It's a hypertext
Hypertext.
transfer protocol.
Nice. It's the hypertext transfer protocol, right? The web's protocol. So here you go. So HTTP connects the world. It's a hypertext transfer protocol, and the protocol was originally described in 1991 with the origins of hypertext dating back to as early as 1930. So this is what a website would look like back in the day, right? It would load. They would have maybe an image. We can clearly see that it's an H1 tag. That's some sort of line tag that creates a line. And then they would have these links to other HTML templates. So when they click on the link, it would automatically load the next HTML template. This is what it used to be back in the day. It would just be links to other templates over and over and over again. Not necessarily completely other websites. Can somebody take a stab at this slide and go ahead and read through it, please?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. The HTTP protocol was originally designed as a protocol for transmitted hypertext. The modern equivalent of hypertext is HTML. Today, HTML has grown to support much more than just linking from one page to another, but it was the concept of linked pages that uniquely defined the early web. HTTP has also found new use cases. While transmitting HTML is a common use, HTTP can transfer any type of document or file. Today, HTML isn't even the most common type of document transmitted over HTTP. Images, CSS, JavaScript, API, responses, etc. are far more common.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for reading that, Robert. So just like Robert just read, and like the slide states, although it started that way, by now that's not what it looks like at all, right? Now, whenever we go look at a website, we can exchange information over HTTP requests. We're able to send different types of requests other than just GET requests. We have put, post, and delete requests that we can also send. There's a couple of others that we can talk about in depth later on. But the point is that the web has evolved. Over time, we're now able to create videos and post videos online. We're able to do all kinds of different things with the internet nowadays. All right, so an HTTP conversation. So this describes a conversation between two parties, the client server and the server, right? So whenever a client logs on, so I go onto facebook.com, before there's even any sort of GET request being processed, the first thing that gets transmitted is kind of a permission, right? The client sends a request to the server saying, hey, are we okay to communicate? And then the server will respond with, okay, yeah, we can talk. And now you can send me a request for data. And then the client finally sends that request, right? But first they establish communication. Once the communication is established, then they start sending requests and sending responses back and forth. All right. Okay, so here's an example of what this will look like. So we're talking about request here. The communication is already established. And then a GET request gets sent to bio HTML. Okay. The server receives the request, and we've seen this in Flask already. It gets processed, and we see a status code 200 OK. What does this mean? 200 OK.
Means they're connected or it worked.
Yeah, it means the request was processed successfully, right? So the request was processed successfully, and it returned a response. And it's telling me it's going to return a response over HTTP, and the content length is 424 characters. The date in which this response has been completed is here, and it has both the date and time. And then it tells me the content that it is returning as a response. And in this case, what it's returning is HTML in order for the browser or the client to actually be able to render a site. Does anyone have any questions over these two slides?
Just real quick, Francisco. By client, you mean a personal computer, correct?
Yes, somebody logging into something, some sort of site on their personal computer, correct?
Got it. Thanks.
Of course. Okay, let's move on. Oh, and I guess now it's breaking it down step by step. So I probably should have broke it down with along with the slides. So now we can see here, the request line is being processed here, right? It's sending a GET request. That's the method of the request. Then it's telling me this is the URL in which it's sending the request to, or URI in this case. And then this is the kind of request that it's sending. It's sending an HTTP request. Okay, so now we can talk about the different types of request. So here we can see that a GET request is sent to retrieve information from the database. A POST request is to put information inside of the database. A PUT request is to update or change information that is within the database. And a delete request is to delete information from within the database. This is the short version of HTTP methods. We'll definitely go more in depth into each one of them once we start creating our Django server. Does anyone have any questions about HTTP methods here? And out of all of these requests, which ones have we used so far?
Yeah.
Right, we've only utilized GET up to this point. Okay, here's what the URI stands for. URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. And it's just, it's almost a URL. The difference is that this is obviously not a website. This is something that's happening within your local machine, so it's URI. And then I think Sean is sending a couple of resources on the chat if anybody would like to take a look at them. Okay, so here you go. Here's going to break down the difference between a URL, or a URI, a URN, and a URL. So here we see the URI. A URN would have something like example.com, meaning that this is an actual site. And then it would have /bio.html. So it's saying this has an actual host. So someone is providing that site to me. And then it's also showing me bio.html. Now, the difference between the URN and the URL is that not only does it have a host, meaning somebody that's actually rendering this information, it has a protocol, whether that be HTTP or HTTPS, which just means secure, throughout the internet. Okay, so we've gone over the request line. So here's the request being sent. These are called headers. So a header is something that's explaining to the request, hey, I want you to process this request. I want you to send this GET request to this specific information, right? Or this specific URL or URI or whatever it is. And here are some headers. These are some things that we need to include in order for you to tell the server what information I need. So I need you to tell the server that I need, it looks like this is just describing the host and the user agent, which may be a little too advanced to discuss now. But later on, when we start working with authentication, your authentication method may go inside of your headers, right? Inside of your headers, you could describe, hey, here's the authentication method, or here's where my identifying token is in order for this API to be able to recognize me. The API can look at the headers, recognize that the person sending the request is an approved client, and then process the request. Okay, so now here we have HTTP with request and a body. Can somebody read through this slide and then maybe try to break it down afterwards? And by read through the slide, I just mean the note portion.
I can do it. Note request bodies are most commonly included with post, put, patch, and delete requests, and can include all types of content, e.g. image uploads, form content, etc.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. Okay, so that's just something important to know. Now, when it comes to breaking down this slide, we've already talked about the request line. We've talked about headers, but what exactly is going on here? Where have we seen this before? Or something that looks like this before? Does everyone remember? Oh,
So,
go ahead. That was Clarice. Go ahead.
yeah. I don't know. I was thinking about our SQL requests. Well, Postgres, I don't know what we call that. Postgres SQL.
Yeah, when we work with Postgres, we definitely do something like query sets. But in this case, what it's referencing to is yesterday when we were working on our HTML template, I created a form. And before I utilized the event.prevent default, whenever I submitted that form, do we remember what happened to the URL?
It stored the information.
Yeah,
Oh,
it was
sorry.
perfect. No, that's great. It would store the information up on top, right? And it would look something like this. It would say, hey, for the name in the input field of name color, you gave it this information. And in the input of name, you gave it this information. And it would look something like key value pairs. Well, that's what it looks like once you're actually noting it in the body. Now, let's say we've been working with a student database up to this point about creating students. Well, what if I wanted to create a new student? All right. What would that look like? And let's take a look at some JavaScript here. This is nope. Okay, without getting too far in depth into what we're about to do, so let's say const send a request. So the purpose of this function is to send a request. So here we're just going to name a variable saying let request be equal to. So the first thing that we need is the URL, right? So let's say in this case, the URL is just going to be the Pokemon API, or actually we're talking about students. So let's say we're doing it to our students. So let's say app/students. Okay. So now I'm sending it to this URL, but now it needs to know the headers, right? Let's say that I don't need to specify any headers for now. What would it look like if I wanted to specify the body of the request? Well, this whole thing would be wrapped like this. And then when I go to open up the body, I would open up an object. And then I would say, okay, for this student needs a first name. And the first name of that student would be Francisco in this case. And the second name of this student or last name of the student would be Avila in this case. And then I think there's age, which we can make it 54 this time. And then I believe the last thing is subject, which is just a subject ID of 3. Right. So now here's the URL I want to send this information to, separated by a comma. So once we create our request knows that the first argument that we pass in will be the URL that I want to send this information to. If I pass a comma, it knows that it's taking in a second argument, and that second argument is taking all of the parameters that I want to pass to my server. Now, when this request is processed, this is sending this information or this object here over the internet to my server, right? Just like we were able to make a request from our server and everything was coming back in JSON, anything that we want to send it to our server is going to go through in JSON format. Right? So now when I send this request, my server now has access to this object. I can pull it from the request and create a new student instance. Right? So that's what we're looking at here. Does anyone have any questions about this slide here? No questions. All right. Let's keep pushing forward.
Hey, Francisco, I just wanted to clarify what you said. You said you, on that code you wrote, that was a request to pull a student info. And then you said you would pull that and create a new student object using that. Is that what you said?
So this is a request to make a new student. So if I were to specify something like method, right? So my method would be post because I'm creating something on the database. My endpoint would be what's following there. And then my data would be this object. So I would be sending a post request to the following endpoint. And then this data object is what's getting provided to my server in order to create a new student instance. Does that answer your question, Robert?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Of course. Okay. Can I get someone to read this slide, please?
I'll do it.
All right, let's see it, Brian.
Additional request data can be included as part of the URI instead of being included in the request body. So if you do search query Air Jordans color red, the query params are separated from the URI with a question mark, and individual query parameters are separated by an ampersand. Query parameters can be combined in the request bodies.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So now what exactly does this mean, right? What is that telling me? So currently right now, what I created was a request that would have a data object, or an object where the data would be separated from the endpoint, all right? But what we just read, it's telling me that sometimes I may be able to send a request that looks like this. So let request 2 be equal to, everything's going to be almost the same. So the method is going to be post, right? But when we take a look at the endpoint is going to be the biggest difference. I apologize. I'm trying to format this better. So the endpoint now will look as in app/students, right? And then once it's time to take in the query parameters, I would then do a question mark, because that's how we know we enter the query parameters. And then it tells me everything that space would have in percentage sign. And then every time I change the query, there would be an ampersand. Or an and sign. I think that's called the ampersand. I forgot what it's called. All right. So now we're going to do first name. And then that's going to be equal to Francisco. Once we go into the last name, it would look like this. That would get equal to Avila. The next thing would be age. That'd be equal to 54. And then the last thing would be subject. And that would be equal to 3. So these two are equivalent to each other. What's the main difference between these two requests? And why would I want to do request in the way that's displayed in the first request rather than the way I display it in the second request?
Readability?
Okay, readability, yeah, that makes sense. And speaking about readability, right? Whenever this request is sent, is all of the information being exposed inside of the endpoint?
No.
It's not, right? While in request 2, I'm exposing everything that the user is trying to enter into the database. It's all being exposed and it's being saved as a record saying, hey, this request was sent. And now that exists forever in the existence of my site. Whereas here, this data object does not get saved in the request process. Only the endpoint and the method get saved. Right? So whenever you send requests that have actual data, try to send it in the first method. All right. So now here we're going to talk about request headers. Can I get somebody to start reading through this table here?
So post was actually sorry. Request headers provide additional context about the requests. Some examples are post, which is example.com. And that tells the web server the domain the client is requesting the content from. Often a single web server will serve content from multiple domains, sometimes called virtual hosts. The server uses this header. The server uses this header to determine which content to serve. And then accept language. English is the client lets server know which languages it prefers. the response be sent back in. User agent, which can be Google Chrome 53.2, is which type of client sent this request. Sometimes the server will respond differently based on the UA field. And accept, which can equal text or /HTML or text /plain. And that's representative of what format response the client what format response is the client interested in receiving, HTML, an image, or JSON.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. Appreciate it. All right. So now here's the HTTP response, right? The request gets sent, the response gets processed. We already talked about it. It's saying, hey, this response was processed successfully. Responses also have headers. It's telling me the content length of the response will be 424 characters, the date it was processed and completed, and the content that it's returning. And then afterwards, it will tell me the body. So this is what I'm returning, and that's for the front end to figure out what they want to do with this information. Okay, we've talked about this portion. So we haven't talked about status codes just yet. So here we go. Earlier, we ran into 404s, where it's 404 not found. We're running our Flask server. So when we're running our Flask server, we got a 404 not found. Well, that just means that the endpoint or whatever URL you are trying to reach for that host doesn't exist. So it's going to give you a not found. Now, a 500 internal server error, that means somewhere inside of your logic or the views that you created, those functions that you created to return a response for an endpoint, have an error, and they are causing your server to fail and cause an issue. So this is saying that the problem is on the server, not on the client. 401 unauthorized, that just means that the server doesn't have the correct permissions to be able to do this, or the client doesn't have the correct permissions to be able to do this. So maybe they need to include their authentication header and actually place in their user token, or maybe they just need to fix their session ID, one of those two, to be able to authenticate and then continue on with their process. Now, a 400 bad request, that means that the client didn't provide the information needed in order for the request to be completed properly. So that's the main difference between 400 and 500. 500 says, hey, there's an error, and this error is my fault. 400 is saying, hey, there's an error, and this error is your fault because you're not giving me the information that I need. And then 302, see other, that just means this endpoint doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it's part of an older version of the API. So now we need you to go to this new endpoint that's been updated and is currently functioning right now. That's it for status codes. Does anyone have any questions over this slide?
So you said 500 is just the internal errors that kind of just like you wait and either your internet is messed up or something, or what
No.
would that be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me see here. We have this Flask server. So in this Flask server, right, if I were to get a 500 internal error, how could I make this happen? Let's see. Let's say that instead of trying to access student.h, I was trying to access something that doesn't exist, right? Something like does not exist. Well, this isn't a property that existed, right? There's no such thing as does not exist. So because there's no such thing as does not exist, when this app route gets triggered or this endpoint gets triggered, it's going to attempt to process this information. Now, when it attempts to process this information, it's going to get here to line 43, and it's going to cause an error. Now, this error is not handled. So what we'll see is a 500 internal server error. So let me make sure. Okay, so here we see the status 404 saying not found because I don't have anything at an empty path. I need to go to students. All right, I can say students. Now, when I go to it, I see an attribute error. So it's telling me, hey, there's an error, does not exist. Oh no, it's showing me 304. Let me see. Okay, so here it is. Here's the 404 that worked correctly, right? And now we get this 500. It's saying, hey, there's an error. There's an internal server error. So it's telling my client or whoever is trying to contact the server that something on the server is messing up. It's not working correctly. So me as a developer, if I see a status code 500, that means that the problem is my fault, not the client's fault. So now when I change the attribute and I go to refresh it, now it works well. It's showing me all of the students, and we can see that I'm getting a status code 200. Now, if I was waiting for the client to provide me data, and they didn't provide me the proper data or it wasn't in the correct format, then instead of returning a 500, I would return a 400, saying that this is not my fault, it's your fault. You sent me a bad request. Does that make sense? I think
Yep,
that.
thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. So here's the response headers. Can somebody read through this slide here?
These headers serve a similar purpose as the request headers. They provide additional context that the client uses to interpret the response. Common response headers include current type text/HTML. What format is the response body? The client uses this header to properly parse the response. Content length, 492. How many bytes long is the response body? This header tells the client how many bytes to read from the network socket. Set cookie, currency equals USD. This header requests that the client save a cookie with particular name and value, and then date with a date and time GMT. When was the response sent?
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Cody. This stuff will make a lot more sense once we start actually breaking down our server and constructing it. But this is just an introduction to the subject, right? Seems pretty straightforward. Hey, what am I sending back? I'm sending back text or HTML. How much content is included in it and how much of it should I read? Only 492 characters. Okay. Do I need to set any cookies on my browser side for the next time that we communicate? Yeah, you do need to set a cookie, and that's going to be that the currency will be in US dollars. That way, every time you request information, I know what currency I should return my responses in. And then date. Here is when I send you back my response. Okay, so many HTTP conversations. Imagine a user browsing a few pages on a typical website. Dozens or hundreds of HTTP conversations will take place. Loading the homepage HTML, one HTTP request and response, loading CSS, one HTTP request and response, loading JavaScript, and then loading images. And that's just for a single page. So now what does that look like, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at Google here. And what we're going to look at is going to be our network tab. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. Now we can see that our network tab is actually showing me a ton of requests that were just processed. Right, so these are all requests and responses that were processed, and they were all processed with status code 200. But all of these requests were sent to a variety of servers, right? And they were all completed within a couple of milliseconds. I think the longest one is 127. Oh no, here's the longest one. So 287 milliseconds. And the reason for that is because it's 302 bytes, right? And even now, as I'm talking, the server is still sending requests. Right, so all of these are requests being processed, they're being sent, and I can even look at my timeline here to see what requests were sent at each portion of my program. Right, so we can see these requests being, ooh, that was an interesting one. Right, here's some 2 requests that were sent kind of in the middle in between these 2 big gaps. Then here, and we can see how long it takes for them to complete, right? So here's the start on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side of that green line, that's the end. And here it shows me, hey, this took 122 milliseconds to complete. This one took 287. And it's showing me this timeline right here on the right-hand side on how long it's taken for these requests to work. It shows me the type, whether it's a document or a script or maybe an image. Sometimes it's a font. All of these requests are happening all at once upon me refreshing a Google Chrome page. Does anyone have any questions about this topic or the network tab?
Francisco, would this like be used for troubleshooting errors potentially, or what would you normally look at this for if you do?
Yeah, I would definitely use the network tab for troubleshooting errors. One of the biggest things is, you think you're talking to your server, but you're really not. And people never check the network tab. They're just consistently console.logging things or consistently printing things inside of their Flask server. But it would all be a lot simpler if you look at your network tab and you see what communications are happening between your front end and back end, right? If there are any communications, they're going to show up here on the network tab. And if it's successful, it would also tell you the status without you having to code it yourself and checking what the status is that's being returned. Does that answer your question, Robert?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Of course. All right, let's go ahead and keep pushing here. We got an anonymous koala on deck. All right. So here we're going to talk about stateless. Can somebody go ahead and take a read at this slide, please?
A very important characteristic of HTTP is that every conversation shares no state with any previous conversation. Every HTTP conversation begins with a new connection from the client to the server. It's as if two parties are meeting for the first time. Even requests made just moments before have no bearing on the current request. Server state. Most servers clear all state variables with each request. This means all state when processing a request come from the request itself.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Oh man, was that Anthony? I think that was Anthony.
It was.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. Okay, so here's stateless, right? When we create our APIs are going to be stateless. They are not going to be attached to some sort of front end. It's going to be completely independent, and its conversations with our front end and our database are going to be completely independent as well. So that's what stateless means they're not connected to one another. All three of them will be functioning on their own server, on their own platform, but they will have a way to talk to each other. But if my front end crashes, my server will still exist. If my database crashes, my server will still exist. Rather, it's going to have a bunch of errors because my database isn't working correctly, but it will still exist. And same thing, if my server crashes, my database and my front end would still exist. Okay, so stateless. Anybody want to talk? And can somebody read through this slide, please?
HTTP cookies help retain state like who is logged in or what was their last search across multiple requests. This might sound like a total violation of the stateless nature of HTTP, but even with HTTP cookies, HTTP as a protocol remains stateless. All it has to do with how HTTP cookies are implemented.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So what this is saying is this is going into authentication, right? Whenever you log into a site, what's happening is you're getting authenticated. And I wonder if there's a way for me to show everyone that. Let me see. Okay. Nope, I am not logged in. Okay, I'm logged in right now. So I'm currently logged in, and then to look at your cookies, you can go into the application tab, and in the application tab, you'll see a couple of things. So one, you'll see something called local storage. So this is anything that's being stored locally And we can see that there's a couple of things that are being installed locally. So my browser is tracking on all of these cookies or all of these, I guess, identifiers that are being provided by DrawSQL. Yep, this is all being provided by DrawSQL, it looks like. Right, and here we can see that I have a session ID. And this is more than likely what's being utilized to authenticate me. But let's take a look here. I also have this cookies header. And if I take a look inside of cookies, I can see that I have, oh, here it is, DrawSQL session, right? So here's my session ID. This was set by the DrawSQL server. Once I logged in, the server confirmed my identity, and then it returned a cookie to my browser. I can't access this cookie myself through JavaScript because it is inside of my cookies. If it was inside of local storage, then it would be exposed and I could manipulate it. But because it's inside of my cookies, it is not only inside of my cookies, but it is also HTTP only. It's saying the only way that this could be talked to is through HTTP. And then we have this XSRF token, which is allowing my front end to communicate to their server. And this is also provided through DrawSQL. And their server, every time I send a request now, every time I refresh the page, their server looks for this cookie to be included within these two cookies to be included within the request in order to authenticate my identity and ensure that they can actually have a communication, right? So first I refresh the page. My front end talks to their server and says, or my browser talks to their server and says, hey, can we talk? The server says, well, do you have an XSRF token? And then my browser says, yeah, you gave it to me last time. Here's the XSRF token. Okay, the server says, fine, we can talk. Who are you? So then finally my browser sends back this DrawSQL session. It says, this is my current session ID. And this is what you gave me last time we spoke. So the server takes the session ID, it looks within its current sessions as to who's logged in or who's logged out. And it says, oh, okay, you're Francisco. And then it returns to me a response with all of this information from my GET request. Does anyone have any questions about this?
I might have just missed if you went over this, but is there like a particular order in which those are called? Like obviously the requests, and that makes sense. But as far as the stuff that's under it, like I guess what does that refer on the bottom? Like how does this populate? Is it from bottom up? So that refers like the first thing called?
So these things are going to be added kind of depending on their necessity, right? So I would say that this was the first one added, but I'm not sure if this here is pertaining to DrawSQL or not. But I know that this session ID is the first thing added, right? Saying, hey, here's your session ID. And then my browser also tells it, here's your XSRF token, which is going to allow us to speak to each other. And then everything else after that, it kind of just gets added on a necessity basis. And it kind of depends on the request that's being triggered. Each request is what will set each cookie. This refer down here, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to tell you what exactly it's doing or what it does, since it looks like it's something that's being added to by their server. So I don't know what exactly it does. That would be something that DrawSQL is handling on their end. Does that make sense, Matt?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Okay, fantastic. Let's go ahead and keep pushing here. So cookies in short, we just spent some time talking about cookies. Let's see. Let's have someone read this slide. Someone who hasn't gone yet. Fu, can you read this slide, please?
You learn about how the HTTP cookie work. But for now, here's a summary. The server set cookie by setting them to the client as part of the HTTP response. The client stores the cookies. The server does not store any cookies. Any cookies for the current domain are sent to the server as part of the HTTP request.
Awesome. And then could I get Mason to finish reading this slide, please?
HTTP is a proven protocol It's extensible and has found uses far beyond what was imagined in 1991. It's relatively simple, human readable, and easy to parse with code. HTTP first changed the world by connecting users and servers to form the web, but today it's the foundation of so much more than the web. You'll soon realize that HTTP is everywhere.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. And that was our summary. I believe there's nothing else here. That was our last slide. All right. Does anyone have any questions over anything that we covered in this slide deck?
Can you show that example of code you had earlier? I think it was when you were talking about like gets and stuff like that. I just wanted to look at it again. I guess we could do the classic. You just give us a brief summary again.
Yeah, of course. So here, this is just an example of what a request would look like, right? This isn't the actual format. We'll see the request actually being built out here shortly. But in this case, what I would want is to specify, hey, this request will have a method. This request will be a post, meaning that something is going to be added onto my database. I want it to go to this endpoint. This is my host, right? So I'm providing a host, which is app, and maybe it should be app.com. So here I'm providing a URI, or sorry, a URN. It has my host, and I'm providing my endpoint, which is students. And then I'm telling the request that through HTTP, it's going to transfer this JSON object. It's going to transfer first name, last name, age, and subject as key pair values as JSON. This is going to allow my server, my Python server, to then grab this data and manipulate the data to actually make a new insertion into the database. Now, down here, I'm essentially doing the same exact thing as request 1. In request 2, the main difference is that rather than sending an object in JSON through HTTP, I am including it inside of my URL endpoint, right? So I'm going to app.com, which is the host. I am going to the endpoint of students. And then once this question mark starts, it tells my server, hey, the following things are arguments. So now by looking at this, my server can now grab first name and Francisco. This and sign says, hey, the next thing is a different key. So now I have a key of last name with the value of Avila. New key of age with the value of 54. New key of subject with the value of 3. Now, these two will work fine, but you generally want to utilize this method on line 1 so that you are not exposing all of the information that the client is sending over a request. Instead, it's being secured by the HTTP protocol rather than exposing it through your URL endpoint. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and you said this is just an example, and we're gonna go over other things like I assume fetch in the next part.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Awesome. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is what are APIs? We talked about APIs before, and we built an API in Flask. So can anybody take a stab at what is an API? What does API stand for?
It stands for Application Program Interface.
Yeah,
I think it's just essentially a way to set up like communication between our server and I guess our front end. Like we can, I guess, customize requests and stuff, maybe.
Nice. Perfect. So an API is an application programming interface. And it essentially the way that I want to think, want everyone to think about it is think you go to a restaurant, right? Or a client goes to a restaurant. Now that client goes to sit down at a table. When that client is sitting down at a table, they are essentially on their computer, right? That's our front end. They're at a table. They have all these nice little lights and decorations. Maybe there's music playing in the background. That's our front end. It's distracting the client, right? Well, the cooks are in the back and they're making all of this information and they're making all of this this food. Well, that's our server. right? The cooks and the kitchen is our server. And think of like the fridge as kind of our database, right? When they go to grab data, they go to the fridge, they grab all that food, and then they cook it, meaning that they're formatting the data so that it's presentable for the client, right? Well, now when it comes to the food getting to the client, meaning my server has now formatted this information, it grabbed the information that it needs. Well, how do I get it to the client? Well, that's my API, right? Which is the waiter. So the waiter comes over, grabs the food, right? Takes the food from the kitchen or the cook, and then brings it over to my client who is sitting at his table, ready to see the food and consume the information. Does that make sense? So that's essentially what an API is and how it works. And now we're going to talk about how to actually communicate with our API. And actually, before we go, we have a quick 2 minutes here. So in these 2 minutes, I would like us to demonstrate something like the PokeAPI, which we'll be working with today. So this PokeAPI, I've demonstrated it before. I can see this in view in raw JSON so that we can see the different capabilities that are coming here. But what this PokeAPI does is it's essentially a server somewhere. What I'm interacting with is some sort of template that they're rendering. And this server takes in different endpoints, right? It tells me there's these endpoints that I can look at. I can look at abilities. So here you go. I did type 3 for abilities. And it looks like type 3 is flying. So it sends me all the information when it comes to Pokemon that are flying type. I can look at a specific Pokemon. It sends me all of that information. But all that's happening is I'm going to HTTPS, which is what?
Hypertext Transfer Protocol,
Right.
secure.
Perfect. So this is my protocol, right? I'm going to HTTPS. Then it's going to pokeapi.co, which is known as what?
Your URI.
So this one would be my host, right? And then my URI or whatever is left over afterwards would be here, API/v2. And then this is just my endpoints. Hey, this is the information that I want to get. So here's my API. I'm triggering it. It goes over to the server. The server contacts the database, grabs information out of the database, formats the information, and then returns it to my front end. So that when I click submit, let's go with Pikachu this time. It gets me all the information for Pikachu. So the request is completed. It comes back, and then it shows me the information here. Let me see. My network tab. Let me click on submit here. Okay, so here on my network tab, I can see that it's generating a bunch of things. I'm trying to see if it will show me exactly when this is being submitted. Here it is. Okay, so once I click on this submit function at the end, we can see that the network tab then makes a new entry here. Oh, where'd you go? That might be just a glare. Maybe it's over here. There you go. And I'm able to see that the status was 204. It was able to send all the information, and it came back within 74 milliseconds to create the content that I see here. And I believe Cody has a question. Go ahead, Cody.
It's a yes or no question. Are we gonna learn how to use Postman today?
We will not be learning how to utilize Postman today.
Got it.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this API specifically, or what an API does? All right. With that said, we just got death by PowerPoint over the last hour. So I'm going to go ahead and. Okay. So this is something that we've seen before. We have a database already for students, right? We have a database, everything's connecting together, and I'm able to grab the students that I want. Currently right now, I changed it for something where the students are being filtered, but I'm just going to change it back to all. Well, now when I refresh this page, I can see that I'm getting all the students from my database. All right, let me go ahead and pull a server here. Let me enter students. And if I run select all from students, I can see here are my 6 students. And all of their information is being returned to me as a JSON response, thanks to the API that I built with Flask. Right, so here's my Flask server that's able to talk to my database. This was all of this was to set up my database. Here's my Flask server. And once it's set up with my database, I'm able to create an endpoint that gets all of my students and returns them as JSON file. Right, so it gets all of my students, all 6 entries of them, and returns them as a JSON readable object of all 6 students. Okay, great. I have this index HTML, which is empty, which is my front end. And I have this main.js. And here we talked a little bit about request and how it works. Well, let's extend on this, right? Because so far we were able to create the connection between our backend and our database. So our server is connected to our database. But now that I'm trying to create a full stack application, I more than likely want my front end to also connect to said database, right? How do I get my front end to connect? Well, today we're going to be talking about a library called Fetch, right? And this is just a built-in JavaScript API tool that's for getting information. Well, Fetch. Let's take a look at Fetch here. What does it take in? Oh, can't do that. Okay, so it requests the input or the URL. And it tells me that it's going to be some sort of promise. All right. So I know that I'm going to need a URL, right? So what URL do I want to send this to? Where do I get my response from my app server?
Would it be your local IP and the port that it's running on?
Yeah, so if I go to Control C and I run this app, it tells me this app is running on HTTP 127 and then the port 5000, right? So here's my URL. Now, when I send this request here, if I go over to my browser and I send that request, I get this 404 not found. So this is not the entire thing that I need, right? I still need to add my endpoint. What endpoint do I need to add in order to actually get all of my students?
The connection to our like database.
Okay, so let's take a look here. What connection to our database are you talking about?
Well, I know like we store like app.config, we give it like the key value of our address, but I don't know if that's the address we're looking for. I might have just understood you wrong.
Yeah, so let's see. Currently I have 127.0.0.1. There's nothing at the endpoint. And if I look here, in order to trigger this function that returns me all of my students, what endpoint do I need to go to?
Students. Yeah, slash students.
Okay, so I can put slash students here, and that returns to me the students, right? So if that works on my browser, what would it look like here? Would I need to add students at the end of here?
Yes.
Yeah, I would need to add students in order to actually process that endpoint whenever I go to send it here. Right? It's exactly the same thing as I'm doing in my browser. I am sending a GET request through my browser at this address, HTTP 127.0.0.1.5000/students. That's sending a GET request. Well, now I'm sending that same GET request through JavaScript at HTTP 127.0.0.1.5000/students. Okay, so that's going to send my request. Well, now what's going to happen? I need to know what's going to happen once this request is completed, right? Let's say that I do something like this. Let response, because this is going to accept a response, right? And let's say I just go to console.log this response. Well, I wonder what's going to happen when I run this script. Well, it's giving me a promise pending. Why is that? Can anyone think of what's going on here?
You're not requesting anything specific, so it doesn't know what to give you.
Yeah. So that could be it. Let's see. Let's take a look at some TL draw real quick. I should just put SQL. Okay. So here we have our back end. We have our front end. All right. And our back end is having communications back and forth with our database. We got that established at this point. All right. Well, now here's our front end, and our front end is running a JavaScript script right now. Well, if we also want to establish a communication between our front end and back end. But here's the problem, right? JavaScript does not wait to continue running. Once the script starts running, unless we explicitly tell JavaScript, hey, you can't keep moving forward until this is completed, or you have to do this as a background service, it's going to try to continue on running. So what's happening now is our request is being executed, right? We send fetch at http://127.0.0.1, I think, and then 5,000 students. So there's our request. A request is being sent. All right. JavaScript executes this line and it sends this request. Well, the next thing that happens is it says console.log the response, which is whatever's coming back from this request, right? Well, when this gets processed, our backend is receiving the request, and then it sends the SQL query over to the PostgreSQL. So it says students dot, I think it's DB. Let me make sure. Oh no, it's students.query dot all. So now this query set is being sent to Postgres, right? But while this query set is being sent to Postgres, our JavaScript's already trying to console.log a response. It's not even waiting for our backend to return the response yet. It's just saying, oh, okay, I sent the request and now I'm console logging whatever came back, but nothing else came back yet. So that's why when I look in my terminal here, it's telling me, hey, a promise has been sent and it's pending. I haven't gotten a response yet. That's what's happening here in this console.log statement. So now, how do I treat that? Well, that's where the .then method comes in. And I'm saying .then, so once the fetch function is completed, I want you to then console.log the response. Okay, well, let's see what this looks like now. Nice. So now I'm getting a lot more information, all right? So now instead of getting a promise pending, it's waiting for the server to actually process the request. And we know that our server's getting the request here, right? It's getting a GET request to students from HTTP, and it's being completed successfully. So it's giving me, my server's working correctly. It's able to talk to my database, and it's able to talk to my front end. Well, now when I look at the front end, we can see that that everything's working well. It came back in a status to 100. It tells me when it started it and when it ended. We can see that the status text was okay. There's no cookies. These are all just different headers, right? That came back within my response. Well, that's great and all, but it's not necessarily telling me the information that I want. So now this response, although it's a clean response, it's in JSON format, all right? So I have to tell my JavaScript, hey, this is in JSON format so that JavaScript knows how to treat this response. So I'm going to tell JavaScript to return this response in JSON. Okay. Well, let me see. Before we do this, let's try to console.log response.data. All right, or the data within my response. What happens when I do this? Well, it tells me it's undefined. I know the data object does exist in here because that's where all of my information is being stored. But JavaScript can't find it because, again, my response is not in JSON yet, or at least JavaScript doesn't know how to work with it because I haven't explicitly told it how to work with it. So I'm going to return the response again in JSON format. Well, what now? Now I'm going to tell JavaScript that once it has this response in JSON format, I want it to grab the data attribute from the response, and I want it to console.log data. So instead of doing response.data, I want it to grab the data attribute from response and then console.log the data. Well, let's see what happens when I run this script now. Well, now when I run this script, I can see, hey, I ran the script. A request was sent, and I know the request was sent because it shows it here. It happened on the 27th of October at this time. It was processed and it was successful. And when I received the response to my request, JavaScript was able to console.log the data attribute onto my terminal, allowing me to work with the information. Does anyone have any questions
Can you
about
show that last then again? Yeah, right. Thank you.
this? Yeah, of course. Yeah, does anyone have any questions about anything that I just covered here over how to connect our front end to our back end?
Yeah, so for that first then and the second then, the arguments there, does it matter what you name those, or does it know in that order usually you're gonna get, it's like, okay, I'm gonna use just the response, and then this one always returns JSON, so then the next one, like, it's always expecting JSON, you know what I mean?
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question. So what I am doing here, this response and this data are just variables, right? It's the same thing as if I were to do a mapping function. This is just a variable. It doesn't actually hold any sort of power as to what it's doing it. I could name this, I don't know, I could name it X, and it would still have the same effect once I go to process it. And the same thing goes down here. I could name this Y, right? And everything would still work the same because these are just variables. They're placeholders for the information that's being sent. This dot then is saying, once this promise is completed, I want you to grab the information that comes back to the promise and return it as a JSON response. Once this dot then is completed, I then want you to grab data, which is what comes back as a JSON response. And I just want you to console.log that information that came back as JSON.
Okay, so the first then is the one, so the first then always is expecting just the response thing. And then the second then is kind of like you could technically pass in whatever you want from the first one, right? Like the first then is always getting, like it knows it's getting a response.
Yes, exactly. The first then will always get a response, and that's because that's happening from the fetch, right? The fetch sends a request, meaning that it will return a response. Since a response is being returned, this dot then will always receive a response.
Yeah, and then technically, so the second then you could technically pass in whatever, like you could return 1 in the first then, and then it could just take in like an integer, technically, right? Or
This would cause an error. This is just a variable. So yeah, it would essentially return whatever is in place inside of that data. Is that what you're asking?
I just meant like in the first then where you say return response.json, if you just returned like some arbitrary thing like 1, like it doesn't matter. It's just the first response, the first then matters.
Yes.
I don't know. You answered my question. I don't. yeah, I'm not
Okay.
gonna go too deep into the rabbit hole.
So instead of the second then, you could just store a value. Like you could say let data equals fetch with only the first then, and then you just have like a data object, I guess, in JSON format. Like could you do it that way instead of the second then, and then right under it do like console.log data?
Instead of a second then?
Yeah, so like set, yeah, and then just make it like the fetch, that first return, like store the variable.
Well,
So
the
you could like let data equals fetch. Does that not work?
let's
Is that
try
what, is that why you need the second then?
Yeah, let's try it out. Let's see. Data equals fetch, console.log data.
Do you need a variable name? Is that Python? Am I confused? To like let. Oh, okay. So you need to actually work with the data. You can't actually like store it, huh?
You can eventually store it. But first you need to handle how that promise is being rendered, right? So here we're handling this promise being completed, and we're telling it to turn it into JSON, but we're not telling it what to do with said thing, with said data. So now you could do data, something like this, and then just return data, right? And then maybe you could name this let students be
Got it. Okay, that makes way more sense. Got it. Thank you.
Of course, and I think this should work. Oh no, still telling me it's pending. So just try not to utilize a variable for the fetch function.
Yeah, I'll just forget I ever thought of that. Just gonna erase it.
Now you made me need it to start working. Oh man. Okay, we'll go into this once we could start going into async. But for now, that this is the way that we're making it work. And we're actually going to start going to async here. So okay, so far I have this information. I have to manually handle this request in order to be able to make it work properly, right? I am returning this response, turning it into JSON, and then I'm console.logging this response. Well, now we did all of this, and we did it with the assumption that we're not doing this asynchronously, right? We already saw async defer, and as we explained earlier in today's lecture, that wasn't in today's lecture actually. Async defer is essentially telling my HTML script that it should ignore this or pause on this until it's on this JavaScript until it's able to actually render its function, or it's able to find the things that it's looking for, right? So in this case, let's say that we want to utilize an async function to grab this information. Well, I can say something like const get students, and then I could turn this into an asynchronous function, just like this. And by turning it into an asynchronous function, now I can actually set a variable to it. So I can say, let response be equal to fetch.json. And now let's see what response looks like when I run this. Let me go ahead and console.log response. And let me call this students function. What do we think we're going to see once I console.log response?
It'd be good.
A
What do you
bunch of garbage.
Okay, let's check it out. Well, when I run it, I just get pending, right? I turned it into an asynchronous function, and that meaning that I should be able to wait until this is completed. But it's still telling me that the promise is being processed and that it's pending. Well, that's happening because I never told it that it needs to wait. So now I have a synchronous function. This response variable is going to wait to be set until the response is completed. So now when I run node main.js, now I get my garbage. Because it was being completed.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Joshua.
I see now. So it would say fetch, but then it would like instantly go to console.log response, and then it would say like you would get that promise whatever thing because you didn't even give it a second to actually pull the info.
Exactly. All right. So now I want to console.log the response. I'm able to see the response. So now I can get data, right? So now I can say let data, and I could say that data needs to await the response to turn into JSON. And now what happens if I console.log data? Now when I console.log data, I can actually see data coming back as a formatted array. And that's how I have my information. So now I just successfully connected my front end and back end. All right. I have a JavaScript script that's able to talk to my terminal or my server and get information. And that's great and all. But currently index.html isn't able to render any of this information. So let's do that. Let's actually create some content in index.html. So I'm just going to quickly set us up here. I'm going to name this students. I'm going to attach a script tag. I know that's going to be main.js. And it's going to be an async defer. Okay. So now there's my script tag. It's connected. It's being asynchronously deferred, meaning that it won't run until it's able to find the content that it needs. And now I'm just going to have an H1 saying students. And what I want to happen is I want an unordered list that provides a list item for each student down below. So let's say I'm going to give this an ID of student list. Now I'm going to go live. Right. Let's see what we got here. So here we can see our students tab. We see students and everything's working well. Let me make sure that this is actually working by console.logging I'm connected. If I go to inspect my terminal and go over to the console, I see I'm connected. Okay, great. So now I have this data, and this data object is coming back as an array of objects. Well, how can I use this information to now create list items for each student? So we went over this in DOM manipulation yesterday, right? I essentially have an array of objects. And for now, let's just say that each one of these objects have a key of first name. And that first name then has a name of Francisco. So that's what I have right now. So what I essentially want to do is I want to iterate through this array and create items. But before we even go into that, how can I create an item in index.html, right? I have this UL that has the ID of student list, and I just want to add list items into it. How can I do that utilizing JavaScript to manipulate the DOM?
The whole doc. Oh, sorry.
No,
Oh, was that Kate? Or
You-
Mike? I was going to say the document.get element by ID.
Okay. So let UL be equal to document.get element by ID, and that's going to be student list. Okay, nice. So now we have our UL. How do I add an LI into it? Or how do I create a list item?
Wouldn't you use like the create element?
Okay, so let li equal to document dot create element li. All right, so now I have a list item, and I want this list item to just have something that says along the line, student name, and then Francisco. Or let's see, who do we got? We got Andrew. That's the first person I saw in there. So how do I make this the text that's displaying within this li item?
We have to create a text node.
Okay, so li dot inner text. Oh, not inner HTML. Okay, and what should that look like?
Document dot create text node.
Oh, I see. You want to create an actual text node. So in this case, just to keep things simpler, let's just give that list item an inner text attribute and set it to what we have here. All right, so we're going to name it to student name is Andrew. Now, how do I add the student name into this UL? Or how do I add this list item into this unordered list?
So you do the ul dot append type li.
Okay, great. And now let me run this function down here. So get students so that it gets triggered. All right, so access to fetch students from origin has been blocked. Course policy. Oh. Let's see. Okay, so now what we're getting is an error called cross origin resource site or cross origin. I think it's somewhere along those lines. And what this is saying is, hey, there is a site that's trying to communicate with me, but I currently don't have any way of handling this information. And if I go over to my Flash server, we can see that everything was completed, right? Everything was, the request was completed successfully, but it just doesn't know how to handle that information. So to fix this, we're going to go ahead and add one more installment, which is going to say pip install Flask course. This is going to give me the ability to control cross origin reference site or something. Oh man, I gotta look that up. And this is going to allow me to control how my Flask app will communicate with other applications. So now I'm just going to say from Flask underscore course import course. And once that is completed, I can then say that course will take in my app. And that's it. That will then allow for everyone, for anyone to be able to talk to my app. So let me run this Python app one more time. Let me refresh this site. And now we don't get that error. The request was made successfully, and our function is able to run, giving us that student name. Okay. Now that student name isn't coming from the actual list of students, right? It's not coming from data. But I do have an array of data that looks like this. So how could I iterate through this array to create list items for each individual student that looks like this?
You use the data object.
Okay, so I use the data object. What do I do with data?
I guess instead of like hard coding it, you were asking how to like set for each instance of the student when it loads.
Mhm.
So I guess you would have to do like a for loop and then just yeah, you would just use like data dot and then I guess their student name or however it's stored. I didn't see how it was stored, but and then in the loop you just want to set like each key and value.
Okay, so for student in data, I want to create a list item. That list item should have inner text, and I should then append it to that child. So we should see 6 items, right? So here we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's working. But it's still not utilizing data the way I wanted to, right? Rather than just having student name and then be Andrew, I actually wanted to grab the first name of each student. So how can I do that on line 21?
So you do a student dot first name?
Oh, so you're saying to do interpolated string and then include that variable, right?
Yeah.
So variable would be student what?
Dot first name?
Student dot first name. Well, that's giving me undefined. Well, I wonder what's happening. Let's see what student is.
Do we need
So it looks like student is coming back as indexes numbers. So that seems like there's a problem in my for loop. What's the problem here?
You need to unpack data with like get items or whatever the method is.
Almost. Oh, it looks like Will put it on the chat. So it looks like I'm utilizing in, which is giving me indexes, but I'm supposed to utilize of to grab the actual items within my array. And now we can see that John, Jane, Bob, Emily, Michael, and Francisco are being returned from my API request. So let's do a quick summary of what's happening here, right? So the client logs onto our site. They go to our site, this HTML template gets rendered, and this script.js is then rendered. Once script.js is rendered, the getStudents function is triggered, and that getStudents function is an asynchronous function, meaning it's happening in the background, and it's running asynchronously with the remainder of my program. I then await for fetch to grab information from my server. So a request is sent to my server. My server receives said request at students through a get method. It queries my database to grab all, which is essentially just doing this. It grabs all of the data from my database. It then formats the student data so that it all looks nice and pretty and consistent and that it's JSON readable. And then it returns that JSON readable formatted students list as an HTTP response. That response is then set as the variable response. We then wait for that variable of response to be interpreted as JSON, and that's what gives us our data object or list of objects in data. Sorry, array of objects in data. So now our array of objects has an array of 6 student objects. We then grab the unordered list from index.html, which we created here. And after grabbing that unordered list, we iterate through the array of students and create a list item for each individual student to then append to our unordered list. So now when this script is executed, we get a list of 6 items, each one showing the first name of each individual student. Does anyone have any questions over how our front end is communicating to our back end and how our back end is communicating to our database? There's got to be questions. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, I've got a question about the Flask cores.
Mhm.
Is it Flask underscore cores that we installed, not Flask space cores?
I believe that is correct. Let me make sure. Flask dash cores.
Oh, okay. All 3 of those exist in pip. And then okay, then I installed the 2 wrong ones. And then and then it's Flask from just Flask underscore cores though, import cores. Okay.
I think they do the same download though, because I did underscore and it told me like what files got changed and stuff, and then I did it the other way and it showed the same files. So
Okay, cool. All right, mine does not seem to be canceling out that error yet, but I can maybe debug that after the next session or something.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So now we're able to talk to each one of these to our backend. We're able to grab our data, but let's try to use a third-party API. Let's use an API that does not belong to us. So what I want us to do is I want us to utilize the PokeAPI to render a Pokemon image onto our HTML template. So I'm going to go ahead and start us off. This is going to be a asynchronous function. So I'm going to say const get Pokemon. I'm going to turn this into an asynchronous function. And now you guys can walk me through the remainder of it. We've seen the PokeAPI. And let me just go back to it so that we can see it one more time. So how do I do this, right? How do I get the information? In the PokeAPI, it looks like I have an attribute that's named, oh, where'd you go? Abilities, form, game indices, moves.
is it the URL above has like extra?
So it looks like there's this key named sprites, and then within sprites, there is a key for front default, and that gives me the actual image source to set Pokemon. Right there, we can see Charizard pop up. So that's happening from this API. So how do I communicate with this API to render an image on my HTML template?
So I think what you would need to do is you would make a variable called response. And then that would be equal to await fetch. And then in the parentheses, you put the URL for the, what is it? Yeah, the URL for the photo.
Okay, so which URL would it be? Would it be this one up here? Or
no, it would be the one that led you to the PNG. I think it's further down.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and grab that, bring it over, paste it. All right, so it's going to Charizard. Now what?
Then you would make a variable named data and set that equal to await response.
.json.
Yeah.
Nice. And then before we continue, Anthony has a question. What's up, Anthony?
Hey, Francisco. You know how like the URL for Pokemon typically ends at V2?
Mhm.
We're specifically specifying that we want to get the endpoint of Pokemon Charizard. Are you going to be going over the I remember there was a method that like generates it for you based off of like what information you submit. You know what I'm talking about?
You're
So
talking
like
about saving this to some sort of instance, and then that way you just have to change the endpoint whenever you make a request. Is
yeah,
that
so that way you could do it for any Pokemon.
Yeah, we'll definitely be going over that, not in today's lecture, but we'll be going over that once we start utilizing Axios.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so now we have data, and we're able to grab that, grab that data and render a response. What's next? Do we want to see what data looks like at this point?
Yes. So you would type. You would make it. I would just say Pokemon. I would say make a variable called Pokemon photo and set that equal to data type. I didn't see all the information for it, so
Okay, so let's see, we have data, and then this has this nice little interface so that we can see everything. Okay, so we have data. And in data, we see the abilities, base, forms, game indices, height. We'll see all of these keys. Which key do I want?
I think it was sprites.
Okay, so let's go into sprites. So dot sprites.
And then dot front underscore default.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So let's go sprites dot front underscore default. And let's see what that looks like so far. Let's console dot log Pokemon photo. And let's call the function get Pokemon. Oh, that's not it. I apologize. Okay, so far, it looks like everything's working correctly, right? This is my console.log from JS at line 34. And if I click on it, it's showing me Charizard. Nice. So now we got the image source. Now that we have the image source, I actually need to create an image within my HTML document. So how can I do
that? I don't know if you still want me to keep going, but
no, take a break, Frank. Let's see someone else throw some juice in here.
Is it document that create element?
All right.
I don't know if we need to make a div or put it in a proper place.
What element am I creating?
The Pokemon
Image.
photo?
All right. So now we make an image photo. Nice. What's next?
Image dot source. Oh, sorry. Oh my God. Okay.
All right. So now I have my image source. What do I want to make the image source?
Does Pokemon photo have a like dot
Yeah.
source or something?
Well, Pokemon photo is a string, and that string,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so now we're setting the source to that image. Okay, perfect. So now I have an image. It has the Pokemon source. But how do I give this image to my HTML document? Because currently my HTML document doesn't doesn't have this image, and it's not being added anywhere. So how can I add it?
You have to append it to something in the document. So like body dot append child and then in parentheses image.
Okay, document.body.append child and then image. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. Okay. All right, so currently I'm utilizing one function of get students, which is going to get all of the students from my API inside of my database. And then I have a get Pokemon function, which is going to get a Pokemon image and then render it onto my screen. And now we can see the 6 students coming back from my own database when I'm interacting with my own server that I created with Flask. And we can see our Pokemon image that's coming back from the PokeAPI, from us interacting with their server, their API, and their database. All right. At this point, this is everything that we have to cover for the day. With that said, does anyone have any questions about any of the material that was covered today?
I have a question about what we just did there. Just comparing it to the example with where we went, like in the previous example with students, we created those lists in the HTML document, and then but then when we pulled the Charizard picture, we didn't. I don't think we put anything in our HTML document for that, right?
That is correct. Right. So in our HTML document, we didn't grab anything because what we ended up doing was we just grabbed the entire body, which is HTML body, right? We grabbed the entire body tag and we gave it a new child. So it currently had an H1 tag, it had a UL tag. And then here we're giving it a new child, which is an image tag. And if we look at the console, we have our body. Here's the H1 tag. Here's the UL tag. And then at the bottom, the child that we appended, which was the image tag.
Okay, and then if you wanted to then like modify this with CSS, would you just go into like I guess like body and then modify image within the body?
You could do it here. You could say image dot style dot border.
Oh, okay.
Solid 2 pixels. And I'm not sure if this will work exactly, but hopefully it does. There you
go. Okay, so you can manipulate the style directly from that code there. Cool.
Go ahead, Frank.
So I actually like took a look at the assignment and I looked at like some of the list of APIs that we had for the assignment, and I was just wondering, would you suggest that we like avoid the APIs that have like authorization keys or stuff like that? Because I don't remember going over how to utilize those specifically.
The assignments for today, are you talking about the Pokemon theme page? Or are you talking about the finding the API?
Finding the API.
Ah, got it. Okay. Yeah, use one that does not have a any sort of authentication method. And I'm assuming you're seeing the GitHub repository for that, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then just so that everyone can also see it. Yep, this is it. So for today's assignment, there's one assignment that's telling you, hey, find an API that you would like to implement yourself. Well, we provided this API public APIs list, and let me put it on the chat just in case anyone is missing it. And if you scroll down towards the bottom, it gives you kind of a whole thing that you can choose. Let's say that you want to do something like, oh man, sure, why not? Anime. right? Let's say you want to do something like anime, but you don't want to use authorization. You just want something that has HTTPS, right? So then at that point, you just go into either Catboy or Anime Chan, Anime Fax, any one of these, just as long as it doesn't have an authorization. That way you can utilize these APIs rather easily. Does that answer your question, Frank?
Yes.
Okay. Clarice?
Going back to the, I guess, just putting elements in via JavaScript. If we want to add the element to a specific part, where do we attach like the ID, or do we use the ID? Or if I'm like, I want it in this specific div and not like just randomly in the body.
Oh, so you want to create a div, so then you would do I get what you mean. So you could either create a div here, right, and give it an actual list item if you would like, or if you know that it's a div that you want to create dynamically through JavaScript, you can just say let div be equal to document.create element. That would be a div, and then you could say div dot ID, and then make that equal to image folder. Right, and then rather than adding it here, you could just say div dot append child, add the image, and then you could just add that div to your body. And now when we look at it,
Okay, but if I, oh, sorry.
no problem. So now when you look at it, you can have a division saying image holder, and then you could reference this division later on in other JavaScript. Go ahead.
I guess if I've already created the div and I already have the ID, how do I fit that into the JavaScript?
I see. So if you already created a div, so in this case, we had a UL, right? And you grabbed it by document.getElement by ID. When you want to add items into it, you just append child into that element that you.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a quick one. So I guess with the image and the HTML file, could you create the image in the HTML file like a placeholder and then point your JS file to that image? That way, I guess I don't know, for me, it's easier to understand things when I can see it. Okay, everything's in HTML. And then like if I wanted to style it, I could go into my CSS and reference that image in HTML. If
So
that makes sense.
yeah, so for example, something like this, right? So we have this image holder here. Here's what we'll do. So I created the image. Let's go ahead and give this image an ID. So let's say ID, and let's give it Pokemon image. Well, now when I go into my, let's say, touch name.css, and let me link it really quick. Okay, so there's my href and my style, and then I could say something like Pokemon image, and then give it. So just to clarify, right now it doesn't have any styling, right? But now I can give it something like border, solid, black, and 5 pixels. And now we can see it being implemented. So because I gave it the ID through JavaScript, I'm able to still access that ID through CSS. Is that the question you had, Sean?
Yeah, that's part of it. And then could you put that image ID in your HTML so you can kind of move it wherever you want within your HTML?
So by doing it, if it's an element that I created through JavaScript, I can't hard code it through HTML in here, right? I would have to create this ID through JavaScript. Now, once it's created, the ID exists. So if I click on the element that I'm trying to look at here, this image does have the ID of Pokemon image once it's being rendered on the browser. So I can still manipulate it once it's rendered, but it won't exist until my JavaScript file creates it. Does that make sense, Sean?
Yeah, that does. Thanks.
Francisco, you could also like get element by ID if you coded it in HTML first, right? And then just assign the image to it through JavaScript. And
Yeah.
then you could access it in CSS that way as well.
Yeah, I could do something like that. Let's see. So I could do something like image, source, and then just make that an ampersand and give it the ID of, I think it was Pokemon image, right? So I could do it this way. And then in main.js, rather than doing this create element, or this, I can just say let image be equal to document dot get element by ID, and then the ID would be Pokemon image. And then I believe everything else would remain the same. It already has that. I don't need to append child. And it would still give me the same result.
Okay. Yeah, I just ask because I don't know. It seems like more organized when you do it that way. I don't know if that's a thing or if it doesn't matter.
I don't think it's more organized, and the simple reason why I say that is because what happens if I have an error? Well, now look at my site. Right? Now I have an error. Now this is going to exist on my site the entire time. Right? Whereas if I create it all through JavaScript, if I have an error, an image won't even show up.
I guess maybe you could break it up by functions then if you wanted to just make it more organized, right?
Yeah, definitely. You could definitely try to use more of the single responsibility principle and try to chunk up your functions.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Okay. Let me go ahead and stop